February 21st, 1988, mega superstar televangelist Jimmy Swaggart cries on TV in front of his congregation at the Family Worship Center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, begging for mercy and forgiveness for an undisclosed sin he has committed.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
Later, it's confirmed by prostitute Debra Murphree that this sin was time spent with her and the acts she'd regularly perform for Big Jim when he'd come visit her at the Travel Inn on Airline Highway down in New Orleans. It's a fine hypocrisy. A man who preached so vehemently against sins of the flesh ends up being hooked on porn and prostitutes. And it was this moment that started the domino effect that would sink Jimmy's spiritual credibility forever. But what people may or may not know is that Swaggart was equally a menace outside of his sexual proclivities. The story of Jimmy Swaggart, like much of the televangelist world, is one of absolute power, ambition, and feeding a big old God-spewing ego. Between 1986 and 1991, Jimmy's story is filled to the fire and brimstone with not only disturbing sexual escapades, but there's conspiracies, trials, and yeah, even an exorcism. When you pull back the curtain on Jimmy Swaggart the man, you'll always find a professional pervert. But more so, you'll find someone convinced he could not only interpret God's word, but become God, and pass down his own brand of heavenly judgment upon others. And all of this would contribute to what would become a magnificent fall from grace for the great Jimmy Swaggart in the late 1980s. So strap in tight for this fascinating story in which I will not slander Ron Paul nor Ross Perot. Televangelists are painfully obvious scammers that preach what many call the prosperity gospel, a promise that God is not only going to collect interest on your behalf, but also write you multiple stimulus checks while you're still on earth. Basically, you're urged to give money to the church and somehow God will bless you financially in return, which results in these lovely tax-exempt organizations getting buku bank. But it doesn't take my superior Catholic high school degree to know Jesus' true teachings were about humility and love, and not whatever these plastic surgery looking ghouls are selling. Now, I could go on forever about the great televangelist scam, but we have to hone in on Jimmy. And when it comes to the world of televangelists, Jimmy didn't always fit that conventional TV minister mold. You see, Jimmy maintained a pretty proletariat vibe, unlike his more celebrity-like counterparts back in his heyday of the 70s and 80s. The king of honky-tonk heaven was born in 1935 in rural and very poor Faraday, Louisiana, cousin to both rock and roll legend Jerry Lee Lewis and country singer Mickey Gilley. His devout mother instilled in him early that he was a perfect being. He first started speaking in tongues around the age of 8, and then apparently turned clairvoyant, according to his camp, by predicting the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings during World War II. Okay. His eventual rise as powerhouse minister began with him playing music in his father's Assemblies of God church before dropping out of high school in the 9th grade and began preaching on his own, traveling from flatbed trucks to revivalist tents, building himself a reputation as a man of the people. Jimmy eventually landed on the radio in the 1960s before appearing on Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker's television channel, the Praise the Lord Network, establishing himself a powerful TV presence and having regular telecasts by 1975. Jimmy's style and message was somewhat grounded too, albeit in the archaic, extremely biblical kind of way. It was all end times, literal interpretations of the Bible, and strict resistance to all things modern and secular. He was anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-education, anti-psychology, pro-capital punishment, used his superior 8th grade science knowledge to deduce you could catch AIDS from restaurants with gay waitstaff, and naturally, anti-pornography. Wrap this up with a fiery populist delivery through both message and music, crafted from the AOG's Pentecostal holy roller roots, and it created a sweaty, almost sexual imposing figure capable of raining down effective praise or damnation upon anyone that crossed his path. From a capitalist standpoint, Jimmy was a self-made man who put in the work to build his empire from pretty much nothing. By 1980, he built his own church in South Baton Rouge, the Family Worship Center, rebranded everything into Jimmy Swaggart Ministries, and his popularity and wealth exploded in his very suburban Bible Belt region. Sufficient dick joke. By 1985, he had over 2,000 people employed, 500 men enrolled in his Bible college, dozens of gold gospel records on his wall, multinational operations, and a private jet. He was televised in at least 145 countries and made around $150 million annually. I mean, the man had his own zip code because he received more than 50,000 pieces of mail a week. By this point, Jimmy boasted he lived in a humble two-story home, when most people described it as a palatial castle mansion surrounded by a moat. And so yeah, over time that proletariat veil gradually got thinner and thinner. But still, these simple origins, his non-flamboyant image, and old-school message allowed him to remain steady on insisting his church needed money, to such an urgent extreme that letters were received from two elderly sisters asking if it would be a sin to end their lives and donate the insurance money to the church.
I'm not a charlatan, I'm not a fake.
I'm honest.
Jimmy also kept a very tight circle of associates made up of family, including his wife Frances and son Donnie, and other loyal fellow AOG or Assembly of God ministers willing to do his bidding if he so asked them to. By 1986, Jimmy was seen as one of the top 5 evangelists in the world. JSM was taking in $12 million a month, and he was making regular appearances on secular media to offer his respected wisdom on ongoing national or world news. He had wealth, power, influence, and most importantly, a perception of God being on his side. So when you literally have the ear of everyone, who's to say you can't reinvent the truth to your own liking? And when you're embedded in the culture of cutthroat American capitalism to your benefit as well. Well, beginning in 1986, getting to the top of this proverbial mountain was the first step to Jimmy's great collapse, because his desire for power then morphed into a series of attacks against other ministers that I guess he thought threatened his status as top dog. I don't know the inner machinations of people that justify everything with their own infallible interpretation of the Bible, but it must be nice. That being said, Jimmy judged them on what he personally knew best. Sins of the flesh. Around this time, rumors had begun swirling around about Jim Bakker of the aforementioned PTL network fame, and an alleged affair he had with his secretary. When the Swaggart camp heard of this, they planned to use it to their advantage as part of a play to go after an AOG minister in Jimmy's own neck of the woods, the Reverend Marvin Gorman of the First Assembly of God Church in New Orleans. Keep this info and Bakker in your back pocket for now, and let's jump to Gorman. In 1986, Marvin Gorman was a star on the rise. His New Orleans congregation surpassed 5,000, a number actually larger than Swaggart's Family Worship Center congregation. His popularity had elevated him to assistant superintendent of the National Presbytery, and he too was regularly featured on the PTL network. Now, Gorman was looking to expand his enterprises with plans to purchase 2 TV stations in Houma and Lake Charles, Louisiana, for a satellite uplink to spread his ministries even further. To help close on the Lake Charles location, he acquired the services of lawyer Hunter Lundy, actually a recent candidate in the 2023 Louisiana governor's race, and the author of the book Let Us Pray, which has been my main source for this video. With all things looking up for Gorman, everything would suddenly change for him though on the night of July 15th, 1986. As it's told, another Assembly of God minister, David Savage from nearby Kenner, Louisiana, confronted Marvin Gorman on this day on whether or not he had a long ongoing affair with his wife, Linda Savage, who had sought out marital counseling from Gorman. During the midst of this confrontation, though, mediation was randomly requested by Savage. Another New Orleans-based AOG minister, Michael Indes, was called upon to help out. When Indes joined, the ordeal somehow quickly escalated, and Michael's mediation grew into a field of accusations beyond just Marvin and Linda's affair to include sexual affairs with lots of women over many years. Then, feeling this was beyond his own mediating abilities, Indes suggested they take the matter straight to the top. To Jimmy, Jesus, and Ronald Reagan combined Swaggart. Now the truth was, Gorman did have a one-night affair with Linda Savage in December 1978, in which he answered a call from Linda at a nearby motel where she was threatening to end her life. As Gorman told it, when he went to comfort her, the two ended up having sex. Gorman admitted this on July 15th, and David Savage even supposedly forgave him that night, but as you'll see, that wouldn't really matter at all. Jimmy Swaggart just so happened to be wide open that evening to help mediate the situation. The men drove up to his Baton Rouge home where he and his goons, Bill Treby and Jim Rentz, waited. When they arrived, all 4 men proceeded to shred into Gorman, building on Indes's allegations of multiple affairs and trying to force Gorman into admitting guilt. Gorman maintained his innocence though, and denied everything outside of the one-night stand with Linda. Then Jimmy snuck in the comment that the purchase of his TV stations would no longer be able to go through, and he would have to inform the bonding company of his moral failure. Whatever the case, Gorman probably assumed this was too much of a fight against too many powerful people. He refused to serve a 1-year suspension and 2-year rehabilitation and voluntarily gave up his AOG credentials. He went home that night, confessed to his wife Virginia of his infidelity, and the next day his immediate resignation was announced in a letter to his congregation with no explanation to why. But that wasn't enough for Jimmy Swaggart. Surprise, surprise, it turns out Swaggart, Treby, and Indes just so happened to have a discussion on July 11th and 14th about Linda Savage, indicating that Swaggart's surprised Pikachu face upon hearing the allegations on July 15th was a big old farce he was well prepared for. Then, as Marvin's career and television station deals fell through, the Swaggart gang doubled down on sinking him. Swaggart's camp met up a few days later and built up even more accusations. Plainly that Gorman maintained a lifestyle of affairs going back to the 1960s with a list of at least 15 unnamed women. And to throw salt in the wound, they went on to accuse Gorman of misusing funds from his own church. This was all drafted in a letter read to several New Orleans congregations on July 20th, with the Louisiana AOG and National AOG also releasing their own letters, spurred on by Swaggart. Then on August 20th, Swaggart issued the letter nationwide, where it was published in high-profile places like the Washington Post. Then things just got stupid. With Gorman's face already deep in the mud, a story then broke out, as it was told by the Reverend Tom Miller of New Orleans. During a September 1986 meeting with AOG ministers and executives, he told them of a very recent and disturbing experience he had. On September 7th, down on Canal Street in New Orleans, a woman only by the name of Teresa brought into Miller's church a 14-year-old deaf-mute girl named Rosary Ortego, and she was possessed by the devil. Miller then performed an all-night grueling exorcism on the girl until she was finally freed of the demon's grip by the morning. But during the course of the exorcism, at one point, the demonic entity allegedly within Ortego shifted to an all too familiar voice and uttered the phrase, exorcism voice, devil voice, okay, here we go.
I am going to destroy the assembly of God and all you Christians.
The voice, Tom Miller swore, was none other than Marvin Gorman's. Oh yeah, this is the face of a demonic conspirator with a mass adultering gig on the side. Safe to say, thanks to the many backing of Swaggart's claims and people actually buying Marvin being a demon, Gorman's career was seemingly over. For whatever reason, he didn't immediately pursue legal action. Instead, he went quiet. That is until January 1987. In the meantime though, Jimmy took what he executed here to turn his sights now on Jim Bakker. Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker need their own video, they really do. They are the Mona Lisa of lavish televangelist couples. The PTL network was a money-making hog in the 1980s, and they, unlike Swaggart, had no problem flaunting their wealth. I mean, look no further than the entire amusement park they owned called Heritage USA. And speaking of which, I just gotta shout out Righteous Gemstones.
Go outside, nerd.
In September 1986, with rumors swirling around Bakker's affair, Jimmy didn't waste this opportunity. He attempted to blackmail Jim Bakker in order to get him to remove Marvin Gorman from all PTL programming. If he didn't, he'd leak the affair to the press. Bakker refused though, and even went on to publicly defend Marvin Gorman. So Jimmy ramped up the rhetoric to pressure him, including calling Jim sissified, claiming financial improprieties within PTL, and insinuating Bakker was bisexual, maybe even entirely gay. Bakker simply responded by canceling all of Swaggart's broadcasts on the PTL. So in March 1987, Jimmy leaked the affair rumors to the Charlotte Observer, throwing Bakker into national headlines. This all led to the PTL going completely under after the discovery of hush money regarding the affair and an overall misappropriation of church funds that saw Bakker eventually go to prison. So I guess Jimmy's not a total liar, but this was clearly a power move first and a spiritual accountability matter second. Jimmy had seemingly conquered two ministers almost with one giant stroke. But it wasn't over. Because in January 1987, Marvin Gorman rose from his supposed buried grave to sue Jimmy Swaggart for defamation. Gorman had recruited famous civil rights lawyer Tommy D. Frazier from Oklahoma, who brought on Hunter Lundy as well as his counsel. They filed suit against not only Swaggart, but also Bill Treby, Michael Indes, Jim Rentz, the Louisiana AOG, the National AOG, and even the Reverend Tom Miller. But Frazier made it clear, the true target was Jimmy Swaggart. The financial amount desired from all parties, $90 million. But Gorman's pursuit for justice wasn't easy. Over the next 4 years, sufficient evidence would be built by Gorman's camp, but first they'd have to get past Jimmy's heavy influential power. The suit was filed in New Orleans to build a jury from the heavy Catholic and black population, a group typically beyond Jimmy's white suburban sway. But Jimmy had an arsenal of top New Orleans lawyers who had election power over the first judge assigned to the case, Judge Richard Ganuccio, who did throw out the case initially in 1987, declaring the matter was one of church principles and not defamation. Fortunately, after several weeks, a successful appeal brief was issued and oral arguments were planned to be made in the appeals court. But the uphill battle was apparent. Gorman had outsider lawyers going up against cream-of-the-crop New Orleans attorneys on their home turf. Then, to make matters worse, Swaggart's lawyers had influence over media coverage, including a TV piece run on Gorman by New Orleans WWL journalist Bill Elder. Gorman had refused to participate in the piece, but Swaggart's team had no problem jumping on board, only painting Marvin in a further negative light with a one-sided story. This act would also end up doing the most damage as far as defamation goes, with the piece reaching over 200,000 homes on the Gulf Coast. Local trial coverage by the Times-Picayune newspaper was no better, since Swaggart's lawyers at the firm Stone Pigman had sway over both their editorial and news departments. It was starting to look like Jimmy and the establishment was well on its way to strong-hand its way out of this. But then, in the midst of it all, the most unimaginable of events went down. You see, Marvin's son Randy Gorman held a deputy role for the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Department as a political favor from Sheriff Harry Lee in Metairie, Louisiana, right outside of New Orleans where Gorman's headquarters were located. Back in the fall of 1986, right after Swaggart had taken Gorman down, rumors started circulating around the department about someone who looked like Jimmy Swaggart, driving his Lincoln Town Car down Airline Highway and popping up at the Travel Inn, the place where you went for hookers, drugs, or both. So Randy started to investigate. He eventually got in touch with prostitute Debra Murphree, who had a regular room at the Travel Inn, and she revealed to Randy that she did have a client who only went by the name Billy, and that she was sure it was Jimmy Swaggart. So over the course of the next year, even after Marvin had filed the defamation suit, Randy decided to surveil the Travel Inn himself, waiting to catch a photograph of Swaggart in the act. Then on October 17, 1987, Randy spotted the town car. Murphree came out to meet this Billy, and without question, it was Swaggart. Randy called his father to come as quickly as possible, but Marvin was a good distance away. Now, there are differing stories about what happened from here, but at some point Murphree got suspicious about being watched, spooking Swaggart in the process. In an attempt to keep him there, Gorman had Swaggart's tire valve cut. When Jimmy tried to make his escape, he only got a few feet before realizing he had a flat. While he frantically changed the tire, Randy snapped picture after picture. And then Marvin Gorman showed up. He walked up to Billy and asked only one question. "Jimmy, what do you think you're doing?" The rare case of poetic justice is too far and few in between in this life. Marvin Gorman, a man called in front of everyone a sexual deviant by Jimmy Swaggart, personally catches Jimmy Swaggart being a sexual deviant. There are so many questions about self-sabotage in this. Like, why would Swaggart go looking for prostitutes literally blocks away from Gorman's headquarters? Did Jimmy kind of want to get caught as some form of atonement? Or was this just Jimmy pissing all over Gorman's tree after taking him out? We'll never truly know, but holy shit, dude, find another hooker hole away from people you've turned into sworn enemies. This is 101. Now you might be asking yourself, if you're keeping track of the dates, wait, October 1987, didn't Jimmy's apology take place in February 1988? That's a 5-month gap. And the answer is duh, of course they tried to bury this. After catching Jimmy, Gorman and Swaggart talked for 2 hours, in which Jimmy actually apologized and admitted to spreading the lies about Marvin. He also admitted that he loved prostitutes since he was a teenager and that he needed serious help. The The next morning, Jimmy phoned Marvin to meet in Kenner along with his wife Frances. It turns out Frances wasn't really concerned about her husband's infidelity, rather she was there to negotiate. What would it take to withdraw from the trial appeal in favor of not going public with the details? Marvin insisted he was only there to address their personal matters, but maybe as a gesture of love he was offering Jimmy at this moment, he'd consider publishing a retraction of all the lies he told? Jimmy alluded he would do so in his magazine, The Evangelist, but then he tried to buy Marvin off with a permanent position within Jimmy Swaggart Ministries. But Marvin was taken aback by all of this, and honestly he was probably thinking, I'm not letting Jimmy Swaggart buy me. So he refused the position. However, following these initial meetings, Marvin remained confident Jimmy would stay true to his word and take back his previously made statements. Yeah, that didn't happen. Some communication remained between the two camps over the next couple of months, but then the Swaggarts went radio silent. Jimmy probably thought by this point, any accusations from Gorman would fall deaf on the public, because why would they believe him? It would only seem like he was seeking revenge for Jimmy ruining him. But the one little damning detail Jimmy didn't know during this time, just when he could feel the fresh air of being in the clear, was that Marvin had pics. So when word got out about Jimmy potentially leaving the AOG in early 1988, and Marvin wanting a retraction coming from within the AOG church, he went public with the pics and details. Marvin had not informed his lawyers for this entire duration that he and Randy were surveilling Swaggart or were in negotiations with him, but now Frazier and Lundy quickly muzzled Gorman in an attempt to hopefully use the event to their benefit. And so we're back at the cryfest. Of course, Jimmy masterfully shrouded the whole ordeal in mystery and kept all of the specifics about his sin out, while his congregation gathered around him in support in what was undoubtedly a financial killing that day. There is this one guy that you can hear in the audio though, and he definitely wasn't buying the act.
Until it is in the seas of God's forgetfulness.
Get off the stage!
So with greater context, you can see now just how ridiculous and insane getting just here was. And we're not even done yet. Jimmy announced a self-imposed 3-month preaching suspension with the blessing from the Louisiana AOG. Jimmy Swaggart Ministries was just too big to fail, and a slap on the wrist was all anyone could afford, including those on the Louisiana AOG Council who helped destroy Marvin Gorman for much less. But then Debra Murphree saw the cryfest and came out of the woodwork to talk. She got a lawyer and started doing interviews and penthouse spreads, giving specifics to what went down when old Billy came to visit her. That's when the National AOG stepped in and slapped Jimmy with the same punishment as Gorman. 1 year suspension from preaching, 2 years rehabilitation. Like Gorman, Swaggart refused and quit the AOG. Again, poetic justice. Karma, you might say, if Swaggart believed in such an anti-Christian concept. But unfortunately, Gorman still didn't receive a retraction from the AOG regarding the accusations against him. It's just like a group of siblings getting punished even though only one of them did something bad. But let's be fair to the all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-reverent Jimmy Swaggart. How bad could these little sexual rendezvous with Murphree actually be? So Jimmy liked to show up in sweat clothes and a red headband like an off-duty ninja and watch Debra pose while he jimmied his Jimmy. Big deal. After all, Murphree said he only liked to watch, with only 1 case of oral sex and 1 case of penetrable sex. And still, he finished things on his own in a condom or a handkerchief. Safe sex. Okay, he also asked her to get naked in public to see other people's reactions. But I don't like to kink shame anyone if everyone's consenting and no one gets hurt, alright? Oh, but then there's that time he asked about Murphy's 9-year-old daughter and about the possibility of her joining them. Okay, he's a piece of shit. And just to make it known, Murphree absolutely refused that last request. Debra's account has always been the most notable of Swaggart's sexual deviance, but it turns out there was actually another. Gorman's lawyers had hired a private investigator who was contacted by a woman named Catherine Hampton. After Murphree had come out, Hampton decided to come clean with her own alleged account of time spent with Jimmy Swaggart. Hampton was a married New Orleans housewife with children, and on the side, a professional exhibitionist, doing things like stripograms and singing telegrams. Basically, one day, Jimmy Swaggart saw a distraught Hampton at a Shell station in New Orleans. He actually introduced himself as Jimmy Swaggart and offered her some free Christian counseling to help her out with her problems, especially after learning of her very enticing profession. Over time, these sessions became private stripogram shows for Swaggart, with Jimmy promising to help Campen open up her own flower shop. But things then just got more manipulating and controlling. Jimmy insisted she needed to help him preach his ministry better and that they should both help each other out. You know where this is going. Swaggart started asking for more during these stripograms and eventually started demanding sexual favors of the degrading, spanking, leathery, golden shower-ish, and cuck servicing variety, while Jimmy tis Jimmy. And then, like with Murphree, he started asking Campen about her beautiful teenage daughter and proposed that she get involved as well. Campen, like Murphree, absolutely refused. But eventually enough was enough, as Jimmy only got more overbearing, leading her to cut him off altogether. Campen claimed she then received death threat calls for some time before she lawyer-upped with the same guy Debra Murphree did. As the scandals piled onto Swaggart, it only got worse, because Gorman's team had won their appeal. The trial even got a new non-New Orleans judge at the helm that would keep the playing field neutral. Lundy and Frazier hoped to use all of Jimmy's sexual escapades as evidence, however, the court saw things differently. Because in truth, Jimmy Swaggart's sexual behavior had nothing to do with the conspiracy against Gorman, and so this information was forbidden from being used, otherwise it could mislead the jury and cause a mistrial. So all that additional info on Campen didn't really go public until, I guess, when this book was first published in 1999. Okay, so now we get to the trial that was finally set in September of 1991. Well over 3 years removed from his confession, public opinion had already begun to shape Swaggart in a different light. He was known first and foremost as that televangelist that got caught with a prostitute. By this point, Frazier's health had sidelined him, and Lundy had taken over the case almost completely. But they were sure they had carefully crafted a sound case that would successfully argue that Jimmy Swaggart and his cohorts deliberately conspired to defame Marvin Gorman. And based on what the defense worked up as the truth, it all seems pretty easy to see why the jury would rule in favor of Gorman, because it was all bullshit. Let's see, Marvin was accused of having hundreds of affairs and misappropriating his own church funds. First off, they had no paper receipts to back the mishandling accusations, so that's an easy one to clear. As for the affairs, Swaggart's defense had little evidence or victims they could produce to take the stand, probably because they didn't exist. So what kind of creativity could these New Orleans super lawyers come to whip up? Let's just rapid fire these. Alright, for one, they alleged Gorman had fathered Linda Savage's third child. Then they said Marvin Gorman slept with New Orleans mafia boys Carlos Marcello's wife, a woman well over 80 years old. Next, they brought in a woman named Gail McDaniel, who said she was sexually pursued as a child by Gorman, when in reality his confrontation was really about her own interest in a younger girl. It was later discovered McDaniel had been gifted a car for her role in the case, and that she even pretended to be half crippled at the trial. Later, some jury members even caught McDaniel walking up a flight of stairs on her own. I mean, come on guys, try! Gail McDaniel and a deposition tape of an absent Linda Savage were actually the only testimonies by any of Gorman's supposed victims presented during the trial. In fact, it was revealed during this trial just how much of a serial affair haver Linda Savage actually was. A former music minister, Paul Dunn, testified and confirmed his own affair with Savage. As he told it, when Linda brought Paul's own wife to Marvin Gorman for marital counseling, she told him, "Well, Marvin, if you would just get with me, I wouldn't have to be having a relationship with any other minister." Apparently when Marvin rejected her here, that's when Linda went to Michael Indes, who also might have been upset that she wasn't sleeping with him instead, throwing this whole slander thing against Gorman into motion. And that definitely contradicted what Michael Indes said when he took the stand as the very first witness, where he informed the jury Linda Savage didn't tell him about the affair, rather, it was God. The jury told Lundy later that they pretty much made up their mind after Indes uttered that precious gold. Okay, what's next? It was later learned through a woman present during the exorcism that Rosary Ortega was not really a girl, rather a full adult and actor named Troy Lynn McGee, a Loyola graduate with a degree in music. She was also an attendee of Michael Indes's church. When they put Tom Miller on the stand, he remained convinced that Marvin Gorman was present that night in his most devilish form. But clearly this was nothing more than one of the finest Michael Indes productions. Then they got Jimmy on the stand, and holy crap, First off, by this time, the guy must have been operating on what little pride and face he had left. I mean, 2 weeks after this trial concluded, Jimmy got busted again, this time in California, again soliciting for prostitutes. But maybe at this point he figured everyone just saw it as redundant behavior. I don't know. In his book, Lundy describes Swaggart on the stand as having an air of self-importance, regularly amending his own answers with speeches, statements, and declarations that were often objected by his own counsel, because the man was too stupid to not run his mouth all the time. When reminded he was under oath at one point, Jimmy responded, "I'm always under oath, counsel." He even shouted out at Gorman while on the stand, telling him that he still hadn't repented. Lundy asked Jimmy, "Do you think you have the right to decide on who has repented?" Swaggart responded, "Most definitely." Lundy was quick to point out that this contradicted a statement he made on a TV program in which he said doing so indicates you are playing God. It just got sillier with the non-answers, as Lundy asked Swaggart how many women did Gorman sleep with? 1, 2, 20, 100? Jimmy responded no to each, so Lundy asked, "Well, how many?" Jimmy's great answer, "You'd be shocked if you only knew." Zillions? The real truth was Jimmy Swaggart had no issue breaking his own principles by judging Marvin Gorman, because he was above any earthly truth or lie. I mean, the man wrote to Marvin's psychological counsel to inform them of his judgment when the letters first came out, even though Jimmy Swaggart didn't believe in psychology. In front of a congregation he could not manipulate or bend to his calling, Jimmy Swaggart, the pathetic liar, was all that was left for everyone to see. Like I said, the jury did rule in favor of Gorman, but he was awarded only $10 million in damages. And then when the insurance companies got involved over what they could realistically dish out, Marvin ended up only getting $1.8 million. After costs, Gorman took home nothing except a clear name and a sound victory over Jimmy Swaggart for all the world to see. Lundy has a great quote in the book. Fundamentalist religion rarely concerns itself with the meaning of the scripture it so exalts. It is the interpretation of that meaning that's important. Jimmy Swaggart was a professional truth bender, convinced too often that he was right no matter what, to the extent he orchestrated a conspiracy against those who vowed to spread the word he too so cherished. In many minds, religious leaders hold the right keys to their congregation's salvation, so why wouldn't these mega preachers just make up things as they go along? No one is holding them accountable except for the big man in the sky, and they're writing the script on what he says. But like Lundy told the press, this is America and you can believe lies when you want to, but when you start spreading them, someone's got to stop it. So I guess America spoke louder than your holy roller gospel singing ass in the end, Jimmy Swaggart. For every god-awful thing Jimmy Swaggart did, he equally accused others of the very same. He's a hypocrite, a liar, a manipulator, a predator, and the list goes on. Jimmy is still kicking today, though a lot slower and now in his 90s, but following the trial, he never dared to widely criticize another minister's personal life ever again. And finally, J Swag found peace, settling for his multi-million-dollar enterprise being enough. But like every other televangelist out there that needs to hear it, heed these simple words Jesus once uttered. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. So don't be a rich asshole. Exact quote from Jesus Christ. Lighthearted fun fact before we end this video that's gone on way too long. I love True Detective Season 1 like nobody's business, as both a Louisiana native and someone who loves Louisiana's gothic backdrop for a detective noir. But I love it even more so because of the character, the Reverend Billy Lee Tuttle, a Jimmy Lee Swaggart replica, complete with massive political influence, a famous cousin, and possibly a leader of an underground child sex trafficking ring. Alright, not so lighthearted. Ron Paul and Ross Perot Devout out.